This is Luke Sheehan for the Village podcast with Barrister David Langwallner. As part of a series on law and literature, this is the final episode where David will sketch an outline of how the breakdown of the rule of law is depicted in literature. David, go ahead.
I mean, Luke, when we discussed this project initially, it's got a protean quality, it's developed, but it seems to me that the most important point facing the world today is the question of the breakdown of the rule of law. And what's quite clear is that the rule of law worldwide, internationally, has broken down completely. And one has to understand what it is, and one has to understand why that has happened. And one can look at works of literature to show when it's happened historically and what the indicia of the breakdown of the rule of law are. Now, we broke off the last podcast. I don't know if this one will go first or not, but in terms of lawyers who create great literature, we divided it up into advocates and judges. And the last judge we dealt with was Lord Denning. And many people consider Denning the greatest judge Britain produced of the 20th century, except they put on an almost equal status Lord Bingham, who died not that long ago. And under pretty much a settled, hopeless expectation of death, suffering from cancer, Bingham, who was also a law lord, wrote a book called The Rule of Law. Now, it became a bestseller. It's a fantastic book, and it compresses many of the central principles of the rule of law, but I don't think it deals with all of them. And before we go to the literature about this, let's understand what the rule of law means. Let's look at the Bingham principles first of all. First of all, legal systems should have respect for human rights. Secondly, legal systems should have respect for international law. Thirdly, a legal system should be fair. And that means what is called in criminal justice terms due process, or what's called in civil litigation terms fair procedures. Same thing. Fourthly, the officialdom, the gatekeepers of the system, the tribunes of the system, should be independent and above reproach. That means one has to have confidence, if a legal system has to function effectively, that in particular the judges, what the legendary American jurist Bickle called the least dangerous arm of government, have to be independent and non-corrupt. And finally, justice must be affordable. Now, those are some of the salient Bingham principles, but there's more, it seems to me, which he doesn't fully cover. And that is that there has to be a correlation between the expectations of the society and the law that regulates that society. And when there is a dysfunction and disharmony between those things, then people resort to self-help, vendettas, vigilante activity, and so on. Then I think it's important also to realize that the law, in terms of it being fully functional, that the judges must be not just independent, but not bought and not corrupt and not subject to levels of influence whereby their integrity at any level can be held into any level of serious question. And then I think it's also the case, as an expansion of the Bingham principles, that the rule of law breaks down when there is, and this is simply a sociological fact, the system breaks down when there's the rule of the mob, there's excessive civil disobedience, there's vigilantes, there's anarchy, and also when a shadow state takes over. That is when the gatekeepers of the system, the functionaries, the officialdom, the judges, the legislatures, the civil servants are agency captured by other entities. And I think that's where we are today in 2026.
How was he influenced to come up with these principles?
Well, what Bingham did in the book was he tried to condense in that very British way of his. Now, he's a very British lawyer. Apparently, by all accounts, he was a very charming and decent man, but empiricist, crystallization, moderation. And he mosaicked together many writings on what is the rule of law. The rule of law has always been an inherently controversial concept. The legendary, for example, Marxist theoretician, writer, and historian E.P. Thompson, one of the great historians of the 20th century, said that say what you will in his book Whigs and Hunters as a codicil to it, say what you will, if the judges themselves sometimes buck the system, decide in favor of the little guy by enforcing the law against powerful state entities, then the rule of law is, to quote E.P. Thompson, unqualified good. And it is intrinsic to the notion of legal training that irrespective of your personal partisanships, likes and dislikes, certain things have to be maintained. Protection of human rights, constitutions, international treaties you're part of, protections against international imperialism, and fairness on a molecular domestic level, fair procedures that you hear in a bipartisan way, both arguments, in a non-biased way, intrinsic to the rule of law is the concept that you don't make your mind up before, or you think afresh, you work out what one person is saying and what the other person is, and that in criminal justice terms becomes due process. And due process means things like jury trials, things like if the police or state officials behave criminally, evidence is to be excluded. If there's exoneratory evidence that should be admitted, that somebody is entitled to a fair process and a fair trial.
Yes.
Now, all Bingham was doing really in the book was condensing a lot of things in an incomplete way, in a way, because he's a British lawyer and the British have always had, in many ways, the platinum chip standard of justice in terms of justice's fairness. But the problem becomes when the system is anarchy, which is happening worldwide. And although Britain is at levels of remove, it is still being significantly affected. That is when there is a disparity between the law and the needs of the people. There is the rise of the mob and the resort to and self-help and vigilante activities. And when there's the control, which is worldwide, of the legal system and the actors within it, they become like, to quote the famous recent Bob Dylan album, I think it's last, shadow play or shadow actors, like passing shadows. They're controlled by other entities.
So the possible disappearance of jury trials for a whole range of offences, is that part of the process here in the UK?
We can deal with that sequentially. But since, rather than in a polemical way, the podcast about the messages we learn from literature, I foregrounded this by saying those are the themes. I do this deliberately because I do think the rule of law is disintegrating worldwide. But how do we learn from the past? And how do we learn from the great writers of the past when it does so? So I'm happy to address jury trials as well. But can I start with something I learned 35 years ago? Was that right? Yeah, 35 years ago in Trinity from Professor Niall Osborough, who I had a very fractious relationship with and a limited amount of, I think, respect for. But leaving that aside, in his jurisprudence class in Trinity, he brought up a text which troubles me as much as when I read it then, as when it troubles me now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with Haldor Laxness's book, Independent People, the greatest
people,
work
yeah,
of
in Iceland.
Icelandic literature.
Mm-hmm.
And the Laxness's book, Independent People, which everybody should read, is one of the great masterpieces of 20th century fiction. But the Icelandic sagas, the Nordic sagas, particularly the Icelandic sagas, are very famous. And one of them, and we're talking about the Middle Ages here, is Niall's saga, Ngal saga. It's got other names, but Niall's saga is about what might be called, in fancy terms, dispute resolution structures. But it's not simply about that. It's about buying justice. And it's
Okay.
about, if you've murdered somebody, you have an entitlement to do so if you pay what's called reparation, or
Okay.
the term for it is called the Vergild, which is a
Yeah.
Germanic Uorgild. And the book is studded with examples of what is a vendetta and a blood feud and murders being committed, with families having to pay reparation by way of compensation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was a sign then of, in a sense, a primitive legal structure without the elements of a village elder deciding, which is always there in all jurisprudence and law and literature. The legendary legal scholar Carl Llewellyn did a famous study of the Cheyenne Indians and showed the village elder made a decision. But it becomes, in a sense, the substitution of the process of formal legal processes by paying for justice and buying entitlements. And it seems to me that in the control many very rich and powerful people have over the legal system, not least in Ireland and certainly in America now, that if you're powerful and rich, then you can use the legal system and the officials for bribery, deceit, corruption, and indeed paying people off to get the best lawyers so
Uh-huh.
that you can avoid culpability for even murder.
Yeah, it's
And
affordable for you. Affordable for me is not affordable for
that's
you.
right. That's right. But the other person who can't afford that goes to prison. In a sense, at one level, looking at the last broadcast, that's what the O.J. Simpson case was about. But it's more than that now, isn't it? No one's suggesting that Lance Ito in the O.J. Simpson's case was bought. Now we're dealing with a worldwide phenomenon. Certainly, if you look at all Trump's appointments at all sorts of levels, judiciary, I think Jonathan Sumption, the legendary English House of Lords judge, said, and I agree, that you really can't call many of the American judiciary, and that includes much of the Supreme Court of America, in any meaningful sense judges anymore. And that is because the sense of the obvious, of predetermination of what they're going to do because of their control by vested interests, is the case.
Mm-hmm.
Then you magnify that within a structure where not just legal forms and legal processes, but the payment of substantial amounts of money that we don't see or understand how it works, or by using the media for influencing purposes, or social media or trolls and bots and all of that, creates an overall impression in the jury's mind about something. And the Simpson case was one example of this, the race car, but there are much more sinister examples recently about the utilization of social media, for example, to create prejudice against travellers and so on. And it creates the sense, because Niall Saga's medieval work, that we're reverting to a point indirectly Sumption makes as well, and he is a medieval historian, to a medieval standard in terms of both justice and human understanding. At that stage, we've gone way back beyond the Enlightenment, and we've gone yea unto the Middle Ages. And I do think that there's a social shift going on. There's a wonderful book by the legendary Italian aristocrat Lampedusa, which was filmed in a fantastic film with the late Alan Delon, who I was
Yeah.
reminded of today recently because Brigitte Bardot died, and
Mm.
Delon only died about a year ago, and the legendary Burt Lancaster, called The Leopard.
Yes.
And it's a fabulous book about Sicily, but it's primarily about, and the Garibaldi Revolution, all that, it's primarily about the decline of a form of social order and the appearance of a new social order, about a society in transition. And of course, in that context, all bets are off. And it seems to me, in general terms, The Leopard is a very useful book to read, because what we're creating is the end, what is happening, I think, is the end of a society where a form of free market economy kind of worked with social supports.
Hmm.
And we're creating a form of corporate feudalism where people can't afford houses or healthcare entitlements or basic standards of living. And we're dealing with a kind of the destruction of the middle class. And in all of that, we're creating a massive form of populism, which is ugly.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned to me and the previous podcast, and funny enough, all of your interventions make huge sense, but this one I didn't fully understand the implications of. And it was about the Pinkerton Agency. Perhaps you could explain to the people. I've done my research since who they were.
Mm. Yeah, well, they were an investigative agency, but important to recognize that when they appeared, you didn't have the FBI, you didn't have official international spying agencies per se, not for
No?
the US, not at that point. You had an evolving but primitive set of services like police and fire brigade and all of this, and you had the expanding US, both geographically and population wise, and with the same federal structure, so meaning with the legal complexity of somebody passing from one jurisdiction to another between two states within the United States, but each state is trying to apply its own laws. What's going to happen if someone commits a crime or a fraud? They escape to another state, and can they just start again? And so the Pinkerton thing evolved partly as a way to pick up that and to follow people, to provide information. The Pinkerton himself was this curious Scottish guy who had a completely different life. He's the founder of the agency, and
It
he
still exists today, though, doesn't
over.
it?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, people link it to things, that you could link it to justice, but people also link it to darker things that may or may not be some of the
That's
worst
my point.
episodes in the US.
Well,
People,
if you look at it historically, I mean, look at the famous film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I think the whole the Wall Gang, or whatever they're called, were chased by the Pinkerton Agency. And
Mhm.
it's always been a form of extracurrial justice. And it links in also, I think, to things like contract killings, not that they necessarily engaged in that, but people who fund private justice. And
I would say the suppression probably of labor unions, when that depression
the
rolls around in the
strike,
20th
strike,
century.
yes, strike breaking is also part of it. And of course, strike breaking was part of Roy Cohn's agenda, who we mentioned. But the point is, it is the use of often very rich and very powerful people to short circuit the legal processes for the purpose of achieving what they want.
Yeah. Yes. If
And
you, mm,
that that becomes the world today. It's almost like a form of both public and private lynching that's going on outside of the system.
mm,
We mentioned sex case in the previous. It's trial by social media, but you've got these horrible people, many of whom are Irish, using vigilante mechanisms to target particularly Islamic men on media. Now, it's irrelevant in a way whether through social media somebody who's pretending to be 15 or 14 is targeted. It is that one cannot condone a society which allows that form of vigilantism. It's the rule of the mob. And of course, the mob often gets things wrong. That's a crucial consideration about popular prejudice. And perhaps the best novel on this is the Oxbow incident. I don't know if you've read it.
no, not this one.
And it's in a way it's like a western, but a really good western. But it's about a lynch mob. They believe these people, one of whom is very feeble and very old and disabled, have done this crime. So they engage in their own form of justice and lynch them. A lynch mob, of course, is also very much a creature of such books as All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, and often used against people of color in America. But you've done it, so we're just going to hang you. And of course, in the Oxbow incident, the local law, they've gone outside of the law to engage in vigilante justice. And then the local law enforcement officer points at them, by the way, you got the entirely wrong people. Somebody else confessed. And by the way, now you should be prosecuted. And I firmly believe that about external funders, vigilante actors, and so many even of our political parties and influencers, certainly in Ireland, some of the extremist parties are like that. They are engaging in the law of the mob, and they engage. And in a dumbed down, disinformation driven age by social media, we are governed by vigilante justice and guilt by accusation and guilt by the spread of hearsay and rumor. And often these people are promoted by their rank absurdities. And that is the first major problem in populism and the rule of law. And it shows that in some ways the system has broken down because it can't regulate this. And it's most disturbing. Perhaps the worst example of populism were what were called the people's courts historically. And that was Nazi Germany and the Soviets. The awful Judge Friesler, who avoided the hangman's noose in Nuremberg by virtue of poetic justice of, after deciding another abominable case, an Allied bomb blew him up in his courtroom. And Wyszynski, who was the Soviet equivalent, and he ended up actually being the Soviet ambassador to the UN. And Wyszynski, Friesler was worse, if that's possible, than Wyszynski, although gradations of evil, said famously, show me an individual and I will fit a crime for the evidence. In other words, to convict.
Yeah, that sounds very much
And
like a quote from Stalin's fellow Georgian and torturer, Lavrenti Beria. He said, show me the man, I'll find you the crime.
I think they were part of the same.
Yeah.
And we mentioned Adrian Hardiman and his reference in the JC case in the last broadcast to the notion that, as an example of legal writing, the arguments of the state were shameful and were a catch-22. And that, of course, closes out all forms of argument. There is no doubt we are electing populist judges who don't have a moral compass. And there are very good examples of how this is so awful in literature. There's the film and the book, our play, Judgment at Nuremberg, about the judges' trial. You correctly brought out in the last broadcast that, of course, there were various trials in Nuremberg, and there was one trial of judges. And that trial was because you had all of these people, they weren't just Jewish people or gypsies or anything like that. They were often children who were autistic, who suffer from some degree of mental oddity or defect. I'm not being judgmental. And they were euthanized. And that's a form of barbarism. And they're put on trial in this famous film, which did happen in reality, and play about the film by Stanley Kramer. And there's no doubt the culture of euthanasia, which is creeping back in, is extremely dangerous because it goes, right, you're a dependency, right, you're a little surplus, right, you're a little odd, therefore.
Yeah.
And that is, I'm a Christian man only in the secular sense, but that offends my sensibilities without adequate levels of protection and safeguards. Somebody wrote an appreciation of the whole Sophie's Skull stuff, and which goes back to Friesler, who of course was responsible for this young woman being guillotined. And there was this circle of people who opposed Nazism, and it's brilliantly documented in one of the great works of literature of the 20th century, the legendary writer Peter Weiss, and his book The Aesthetics of Resistance. Bizarrely, only the final volume by Duke Press was translated in 2025, even though some of his plays are regarded as of the great works of literature. And I think this is his masterpiece. And the book in Volume 3 culminates in passages of utter horror of the trial process and the execution of dissidents within the Nazi era. And people's courts have no restraint. They're governed by hysteria, by populism, by demonization. And that's true of all sorts of things now. It's not just true of Shari law, it's true of forms of political persecution. I mean, we're talking just after the Venezuelan president has been taken by Trump in breach of international law, fundamental violation of the Bingham principles, the law, invasion of domestic jurisdiction, crime of aggression, and put on trial in a different country, America. And one wonders, will he get a fair trial? He won't. Even Hannah Arendt, the legendary intellectual, when she wrote that fabulous book about Eichmann in Jerusalem, when Eichmann was picked up by the Israelis in Argentina and transported for a trial in Tel Aviv. And Arendt was a Jewish intellectual, one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century. He thought the whole thing was a farce. What Trump is doing to the Venezuelan president is equally a farce and in breach of international law, and for whatever motivations. We're giving in to trials which are in breach of international regulations, show no respect for human rights, no respect for domestic sovereignty, and are politically driven. I think, though, if you really go back to the Fons et Orgi, you have to go back to the Greeks, as always. I mean, one of the great unsung playwrights of all time, almost as good as Shakespeare, is Aristophanes, the legendary Greek satirical playwright. His play The Wasps is exclusively about law, and it's about judges and about the jury trial process, which you open the discussion about. And it emphasizes the importance of the jury trial as a sacrosanct thing. And the Greeks invented Democrates, the notion of, as long as the juries are not bought, Aristophanes argues, when money gets involved.
Right.
And when there's a scarcity of money, the play The Wasps shows there's an attempt to buy justice or buy the judges and target the poor and the excluded from the Athenian regime. And we're at the point now where one feels that that is the case. And the jury trial under total siege in Britain and worldwide is the price we pay for incorruptibility. It is Voltaire's famous statement that it is better that a guilty person go free than an innocent person is convicted. As long as the judges are independent and non-biased, which is the point Aristophanes makes in The Wasps, indirectly. But it's also crucial to the Bingham principles. Are the judges independent? Certainly in America, they don't seem to be now. And are they politically motivated? And then the other larger question becomes, in terms of the decline of the rule of law in literature, is the substitution of what is called formalistic law, normal law, by emergency law. I know that troubles you as well.
There's the state of exception, the suspension of rights and rules.
Sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, the suspension of institutions and the sort of so-called the temporary tyranny, but then it always turns out to be more permanent.
The temporary becomes the permanent, and the erosion and then the subversion of institutions becomes institutionalized, or let's use the phrase de jure, the new normal, and the gradual acceptance of people of things they shouldn't be accepting in the first place. Ireland is hugely adept at all these ludicrous emergency laws. I mean, that's what Helen McEntee did.
That's right. And Simon Harris is making noises in that regard right now too.
Population in an in-camera private set of proceedings with nobody opposing it. And in-camera law or emergency law, military law, is always incredibly dangerous. Then we're dealing with special criminal courts, diploc courts, or court-martial structure, or just the law of the noose. I mean, for example, probably the best text in this is mentioned in one of the first broadcasts, Herman Melville's Billy Budd, where the captain of the ship, before he hangs him up, says, I don't care what justice is or the natural law. I'm governed by the laws of the Navy and martial law.
Yeah.
But we're entering that type of age, and we're entering that type of age controlled by a shadow state or deeply corrupt people who are creating false emergencies. Just like fake news, we've got false emergencies. Or just like Hardeman's substitution in the JC case of ordre public for force publique. It's a very important distinction. Ordre public is public order. No one in their right mind is against that. Force publique is order by force. The law of the state as the mob. Not just the mob, but the state enforcing the mob. And then the question becomes, within the structure of the rule of law, the governance of the shadow state. I'm not sure that's where we're not at now. I mean, the shadow state is when the politicians, the judges, are ruled by gangsters. Gangsters, thugs, hooligans, whatever. And they're classic examples of this in literature. The greatest example, I think, in my view, is the legendary communist Italian writer, politician, intellectual, overarching conscience of Italy, Leonardo Sciascia. I keep getting his name wrong. I know Mr. Smith likes me to pronounce, but an Italian lawyer colleague of mine in London said, although his name is spelled Sciascia, it's pronounced Shaza, and the Italians just refer to him as Shaza. He was the great political novelist of the 1970s and the 1980s, and his great books are such as The Day of the Hour or Equal Danger. Equal Danger culminates with a deeply corrupt judge informing a detective who's trying to expose corruption and everything being fixed. The people must not know the truth. And that's the control of the world by the shadow state. And in Italy, that's, of course, as Roberto Savioni has more recently documented, that is the control by the Gomorrah and the mafia. But it's not simply them. It is the big business mafia, the corporate mafia who control Ireland, the state mafia who control. I mean, the McCabe Tribunal in Ireland was a classic example of the people must never know the truth. And once we've reached that, we've reached gangster capitalism or gangster communism. It's a bit like rereading Mario Puzo's The Godfather, and people can buy justice, or to quote the famous line in the book and in the film, make them an offer they can't refuse. And of course, McCabe in Ireland was given a massive payoff and non-confidentiality agreement after they had falsely accused him of sexual abuse. And it's when the state is in the control of corporate and commercial interests, whether they are drug-related interests or big business interests. I mean, this is the hypocrisy of Trump's ostensible reasons for invading Venezuela in breach of international law. Initially, he said it's about drugs and so on. Now he's saying we want all the American corporations to take over the oil because Venezuela has more oil than almost any country on earth. It's cheap, and indeed, it helps the prosperity of its people to some degree, which of course Trump won't. And the shadow state is when commercial and corporate interests, for whatever forms, control the agenda. And Trump is a classic emblem of that because he's a politician who is a businessman, or a businessman who is a politician. And the best book on that in literature is by the angel Gabriel. We throw on about Joyce and Beckett, and I'm a huge Beckett fan and a huge Camus fan. The South Americans have a legitimate claim to have produced the greatest writer of the 20th century, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And certainly, Marquez wrote two of the greatest novels ever written, 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, ever, about the history of literature. And we mentioned Cervantes in a previous broadcast. You know, Marquez is a greater writer than Cervantes. Well, it's very difficult to say who is a better writer than Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But he was also a journalist and deeply political. He wrote this novel called it's not a novel, a book called News of a Kidnapping.
Yes.
It's about Colombia, because Marquez, though he spent much of his life living in Mexico, was a Colombian national. And it's about how his state, the state of Colombia in Bogota and Medellin, was taken over by Pablo Escobar. It was run as a drug cartel. But in effect, and this is an important point of distinction, important point of understanding, there is no difference between a state being run by a drug baron like Pablo Escobar or being run by Goldman Sachs or a megalomaniac businessman like Trump.
And
And
AI, and as are, really the intrusiveness of devices and surveillance capitalism combined with, the reduction in good faith among the democracies of the world is just going to result, it's going to drive everything towards more. There will be, the COVID was one foretaste of it, and there's no way to step off the path of surveillance and of there will be manufacturing of crimes and injustice within the courtroom as we keep going down that track.
They've got out of control because they create new crimes to suit their interests. Like Ireland's been in a dialogue for a number of years about hate bills. And I wrote a piece which was taken seriously by an opposition political party who withdrew their support on the Ireland's hate bill. And I had a meeting with them. But the point is, everyone's against hatred. But what if you criminalize offence?
Yeah.
Once you criminalize offence, you're offending them. So you say the Prime Minister is an idiot and he locks you up. I mean, there goes freedom of speech. And of course, critical to the dialogue at one level is freedom of speech. And the extreme right and the extreme left protest they believe in it, but they actually are trying to destroy it. It's freedom of speech if you say what we say, and it's become freedom of speech within the Facebook age that is merely propaganda-driven stuff. And we've had generations that have been living under Aldous Huxley's, since Facebook, Brave New World. And at the beginning of the legendary Viennese intellect, journalist, and editor at Die Fackel for 30 years, at the beginning of Hitler, yes, the legendary Karl Kraus, he suspended the magazine. Hitler didn't stop him or Dollfuss for a while. I think he collected his thoughts. And then he wrote this fabulous extended essay called Der Walpurgis Night. And what it basically says at the beginning of Hitler, I have nothing to say, he says. It's about Goebbels. He's focusing on. It's about the way propaganda, Musk and so on, have destroyed the public space, what Habermas calls the civic sphere. And they've done so by disinformation, lying, yet claiming to believe in freedom of speech. I mean, they attack the left at one level legitimately for the excesses of political correctness and no platforming. But then they give a vantage point to ever more extreme and vicious points of view. And then they don't allow a corrective. They don't allow what Jürgen Habermas calls the civic space, the presentation of different points of view in a rational environment. And that has also become part of the dialectic of the acceptance of absolute nonsense. And to your point about surveillance, that creates either the overt Orwellian 1984 surveillance culture or the more covert-driven Huxley, Brave New World, Soma-induced surveillance culture. And those books of the 1930s, and I think both for different reasons, Huxley and Orwell had an inside track in all of this, are extremely relevant today.
That's where it's at. I think that's where it's at. Right? I think that's exactly where we're at.
Yeah.
I keep reaching for my Orwell. Is what I keep doing.
Well, Orwell was one of the great essayists of all time, and he's a tremendous prose master. And if you read some of his essays, in particular The Decline of the English Language and so on, the emphasis on fact and accuracy, on brevity and simplicity and getting things right. And yet what we're being fed is disinformation and nonsense and lies and doublespeak. And Yes, it's crucially important to understand that. But the question becomes, after people have been brainwashed with all of this nonsense, to what extent they can exercise the critical filters. And your point about surveillance, of course, is now all in present. There was a book by a Harvard professor, Zuboff, is that right?
Yeah,
Called
that's right.
The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she shows, how much they've manipulated our choices or identity. And I think she makes the point they're now going to the extent of farming or identity. And what we're creating is a kind of transhumanist culture. And it's deeply upsetting. And people don't understand what their best interests are. And one of the tragedies is the way the judiciary, which are, you know, could be independent, have become ever the more conformist and ever the more bought. People should, I think, also read a book by Alberto Moravia called El Conformista, or The Conformist, set in the fascist era in Italy, immortalized by a film by Bertolucci. It's about how
Great.
well, it's Bertolucci's greatest film by far. I mean, hugely influenced Martin Scorsese, both in style and in topic. And it's about, how once you select somebody, and Amy Coney Barrett in America is like this, who Trump selected, so brainwashed, so conformist, then they'll do anything. And of course, that dovetails back to the Nazi judges. And it's all very, to put it mildly, unsettling. And the
Disturbing.
question, well, it's deeply concerning because it's the absence of the vectors to fight back, which were independent journalism, or
Exactly.
are becoming less and less. But by jury trials, the jury trials was the check of public opinion in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the difficulty becomes if the jury are influenced by a barrage of disinformation. You see that in sex cases all of the time now.
Mm.
And if anyone goes against the grain in this kind of corporate fascist / communist culture we're creating, then they're demonized. I mean, I've represented whistleblowers, and they reduce them to mush, absolute mush. You're hysterical, you're wrong, or confidentiality agreements. You become an enemy of the people. I mean, the classic example in literature is Ibsen's great play, the great Norwegian playwright.
So that was a pretty amazing episode with really disheartening description of the state of justice and how the things spoken of with trepidation and described in great novels are coming true in forms that the authors possibly couldn't have even foreseen. They didn't know about our hyper-digital world. But
No,
there's a
they
humanism behind all of what you said. There's a humanism in what your course through literature has
they
shown.
understood the humanism, but they thought it was isolated.
Yes.
They didn't think this would be a worldwide phenomenon. I suppose Huxley, in his Inside Track, and Orwell in the conditions of the 1930s, which we're kind of reverting to, did understand that. I mean, there was a prophetic novel published only 10 years ago, shortly before his death, by Philip Roth, or 15 years ago, called The Plot Against America,
Indeed, yeah.
where he imagines an alternative reality of the proto-fascist Lindbergh undermining Roosevelt and getting elected. But of course, that's what Trump is. And the lunatics have taken over the asylum. But if we just go back to the whistleblower thing, Ibsen was writing at the turn of the century. And, Enemies of the People isn't one of his central plays. People think of A Doll's House and so on. And yes, he's a great dramatist, one of the greats. But it's a fascinating play. And the play is effectively about a local engineer in a spa town, which depends on tourism, says to his brother, who's the mayor, by the way, the waters are polluted. His brother says, classic stuff, we can't tell anyone this. The tourist season will be destroyed, but there's a danger to public health, he goes. And by doing the right thing, his family, his livelihood is destroyed. And it is a parable, but it exactly mirrors my professional experience of representing whistleblowers in Ireland, not least when I represented the whistleblower to the inquiry into the banking inquiry. They become enemies of the people, or rather, what they become is the enemies of the self-deigned, powerful vested interests who don't want, to quote Leonardo Schiazzi in Equal Danger, the truth to come up, because the people must never know the truth. Oh no. And that's also in Aristophanes, both the legendary Greek writer, both in his play about jury trials, which is The Wasps, or in his other play, Knights, Knights, which is also dealing with the question of law and how the people are sheep and they have to be brainwashed. And if they get disruptive, like they whistleblow, they're enemies of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And it is almost like the great tradition of humanism from Aristophanes through the ages, through Nile's saga, through issues relating to societal change like the leopard, or through the literature on blood feuds. And it's not just things like the Oxbow incident. It's also, there's this famous novel by Kadara, the legendary Albanian writer, and this is about one of his great books called Broken April, only published 20 years ago. And it again is about the paying off of people, the paying off and reparation of people for murder. And the resort to that type of methodology rather than formal court process.
Okay, David, thank you very much.
Very brief. I think it's important to mention that within the structure of populism, people's court, buying justice, the rule of the mob, there is also the demonization of the weak and the vulnerable. That's there in Aristophanes. And it's also there in those such as Jim O'Callaghan and the Council of Europe, who want to diminish Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the protection against, which is the cardinal principle of humanism within the convention now that the death penalty has been abolished. That is the prohibition against torture and inhumane and degrading treatment. It is crucial to understand that the demonization of others is part of the new form of fascism. And the greatest of all, to bookend the series, and to go to the beginning to the end, the greatest novel ever, the greatest man of justice of the 20th century, though not a lawyer, the greatest writer about law, Mr. Albert Camus, and the impish French genius, saw that perfectly in his book, The Outsider. And that's where we are now.
That's where we started.
We're quite close again to Mr. Meursault and all of his dilemmas that you saw in that French film, which I still haven't seen yet. And Camus was so sage-like and prophetic, not just in The Outsider, but of course The Pest, which is about the plague. What happens? The immorality of officialdom dealt with in his book about the lawyer shoot. So for ending the piece on the rule of law, in terms of the lawyer literature, I bookend it and go back to the very beginning. The greatest writer about the law, all things considered, is the great man, Mr. Camus, as well as the great intellect of the 20th century. And from everything, from his works of political philosophy such as The Rebel or Myth of Sisyphus, to his essays like Reflections on the Guillotine, or his three great novels, leaving aside the other great novel.
Okay, David, thank you very much.
You now. Take care. Bye.